Our first speaker is unknown to most of you. He made kind of a rash vow to me, and I snapped it up at a previous conference and said, I'll travel here and speak at your conference if you'd have me. He comes from Kearney, Nebraska, where he teaches philosophy. He's been instrumental in developing a first-class program in that subject at the University of Nebraska, Kearney. And it probably has the impression that not too many people have heard of it. I need to negate that with a one-word negative interjection. I ran into a young man, a friend of the family's, at a wake about a month ago, and he knew what we do with Chesterton and asked me about our conference and what it was about. And I said, it's about transforming the culture, and we're bringing in people, we're bringing in an actor, we're bringing in some other speakers who really can tackle the subject. And I said, this kid teaches philosophy in a couple of different community colleges and college in Texas. He's just out of school, so he's trying to get a start in the academic world. You got to hop from one adjunct job to another or handle two or three. So he kind of knows the philosophy world. And I said, we're having a guy come from University of Nebraska, Kearney, Dr. Tom Martin. And he looked at me like he just swallowed something a little too big. He said, no. He had indeed heard of Tom Martin through a fellow student of his in graduate school, and this fellow student had spoken in glowing terms of the philosophy department at Kearney and of Dr. Tom Martin. And he doesn't know this story, but I just thought it would be kind of cool to tell you, because I didn't think anybody knew about the University of Nebraska Kearney philosophy department either. But it does seem that the reputation of this man and his skill at teaching is indeed well known in the world of philosophy. I've heard Dr. Tom Martin speak before. That's why I wanted him to come here to speak today. I think you'll find him a pleasure, and it's the best way I can think of to kick off the subject. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Tom Martin.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Morning. Thank you for coming. Title of my paper is The Ultimate Test, which won't make sense to the end of the paper, so I'll begin with it. Transforming the Culture is the title of your talk, of the conference. And I would like to thank Lou Horvath for inviting me to Rochester, New York, and the Chesterton Society Conference to speak on transforming the culture by means of the art. Going with Lou's cue, I'll look into the word transform. And you go into the Latin from transformare, meaning to change the nature, the function, or condition of something, or maybe even to convert it. I do not think Chesterton is interested in changing the nature, function, or condition of the culture in America, inasmuch as he is in reforming the culture and returning America to her original form. In other words, we must go backward in order to go forward. In his book, What I Saw in America, Chesterton sees that America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed. That creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. Perhaps the only piece of practical politics that is also theoretical politics and also great literature. It enunciates that all men are equal in their claim to justice, that government exists to give them that justice, and that their authority is for that reason just. It certainly does not condemn anarchism, and it does also, by inference, condemn atheism, since it clearly names the Creator as the ultimate authority from whom these rights are derived. Nobody expects a modern political system to proceed logically in the application of such dogmas. In the matter of God and government, it is naturally God whose claim is taken more lightly. The point is that there is a creed, if not about the divine, at least about human things. As an American, I am one who professes we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. America is firm in upholding her creed, as Chesterton witnessed on his trip to America in 1921. When he went to the American consulate in England to get a visa, he was given a form to fill out which asked, "Are you an anarchist? Are you in favor of subverting the government of America by force? And are you a polygamist?" The previous year, Chesterton had traveled to the Middle East, and such questions were not asked of him before entering the Muslim world. In fact, he says, "These ministers of ancient Muslim despotism did not care whether I was an anarchist. And naturally, they would not have minded if I'd been a polygamist. These slaves of Asiatic autocracy were content in the old liberal fashion to judge my actions. They did not inquire into my thoughts." One might infer from this that Western democracy persecutes, where Eastern despotism tolerates or emancipates. G.K. Chesterton's comparison of the sultans of the Middle East to the American Constitution concludes with the latter being a thing like the Spanish Inquisition. In other words, the office of the American consul is like an inquisitor, the bouncer at America's gate, checking whether visitors would respect and uphold America's creed before being allowed to enter. Of course, Chesterton was amused by the inquisitor's straightforwardness, as though an anarchist would answer yes when given this form, or that someone who is intent on subverting the government would let it be known before his invasion. It is no doubt further amused by the polygamy question on how the Muslim creed would be received in America. But I take this to be a question for another Chestertonian to examine at a further Rochester conference. Chesterton answered no to the questions that threatened the American's creed. He did so while holding to his own creed, the Apostles' Creed, which he elucidates in his work, Orthodoxy. The book is remarkably similar to what I saw in America, as both begin with Chesterton going on an adventure. In Orthodoxy, Chesterton is the romantic English yachtsman who slightly miscalculates his course and then discovers England under the impression that it was a new island in the South Seas. He mistaken would be really a most inevitable mistake, and he knew it, if he was a man that I take him for. For what could be more delightful than to have in the same few minutes all the fascinating terrors of going abroad combined with all the humane security of coming home again? What could be better than to have all the fun discovering South Africa without the disgusting necessity of landing there? What could be more glorious than to brace oneself to discover New South Wales and then realize with a gush of happy tears that it was really Old South Wales? This, at least, seems to be the main problem for philosophers. And it is a matter, the main problem of this book. How we can contrive to be at once astonished at the world and yet at home in it. In chapter 3, on a meditation on Broadway and what I saw in America, G.K. Chesterton misses New South Wales and lands in New York. and upon seeing the bright lights of Broadway, remarks, "When I looked at the lights of Broadway by night, I made to my American friends an innocent remark that seemed for some reason to amuse them. I had looked, not without joy, at the long kaleidoscope of colored lights, arranged in large letters and sprawling trademarks, advertising everything, from pork to pianos, through the agency of two most vivid and most mystical of God's gifts, color and fire. I said to them, in my simplicity, what a glorious garden of wonders this would be to anyone who was lucky enough to be unable to read. Here is but a text for a further consideration. But let us suppose that there does walk down this flaming avenue a peasant of the sort called scornfully an illiterate peasant, by those who think that insisting on people reading and writing is the best way to keep out the spies who read in all languages and the forgers who write in all hands. On this principle, a peasant merely acquainted with things of little practical use to mankind, such as plowing, cutting wood, or growing vegetables, would very probably be excluded. As the yachtsman walked ashore in England, thinking he had arrived in New South Wales, sparkling with the wondrous and mysterious sights of a New Jerusalem, Chesterton's illiterate peasant, knowing that color and fire are the two most vivid and mystical gifts of God, is under the illusion that he has arrived in a new world, in the land of liberty, just in time for a festival. The soul of such a man would surely soar higher than the skyscrapers and embrace a brotherhood broader than Broadway, realizing that he had arrived on an evening of exceptional festivity, worthy to be blazoned with all the burning heraldry. He would please himself by guessing what great proclamation or principles of the Republic hung in the sky like a constellation or rippled across the street like a comet. He would be shrewd enough to guess that the three festoon fringed with fiery words of something similar pattern stood for government of the people, for the people, by the people. For it must obviously be that, unless it were liberty, equality, and fraternity. His shrewdness would perhaps be a little shaken if he knew that the triad stood for tang tonic today, tang tonic tomorrow, tang tonic all the time. The illiterate peasant, like the mistaken English yachtsman, is astonished at the new world when he bathes in the festive lights of Broadway. But this is not because he has not seen bright lights before. The truth is that he has seen them on a much smaller scale, but for a much larger purpose. Peasants also have their ritual and ornament, but it is to adorn more real things. Apart from our first fancy about the peasant who could not read, there is no doubt about what he would be apparent to a peasant who could read and who could understand. For him, fire is sacred. For him, also color is symbolic. But where he sets up a candle to light a little shrine of St. Joseph, he finds it takes 1,200 candles on Broadway to light the seventh heaven cigar sign. The sacred fire and symbol, the colors from God's palettes, are meant to adorn more real things than the Broadway carnival of bright lights hawking merchandise. God's gift of color and fire ought to be used to glorify God and his creation, and not for the graphic art honoring tan tonic and the seventh heaven cigar. This is the real case against that modern society that symbolizes by such art and architecture. It is not that it is toppling, but that it is top-heavy. It is not that it is vulgar, but rather that it is not popular. In other words, the democratic idea of countries like America while it is still generally sincere and sometimes intense, is at issue with another tendency, an industrial progress, which is of all things on earth the most undemocratic. America is not alone in possessing the industrialism, but she is alone in emphasizing the ideal that strives with industrialism. Industrial capitalism and ideal democracy are everywhere in controversy. As the ends, the function of color and fire in the hands of artists and architects are being misused, so too is the idea upon which America has been founded and is now distorted. Chesterton gives the modern reader a lesson in history, starting with the fact that there has been a general decline in the democratic idea since the high point of the American Republic at the end of the 18th century, when it was dedicated to the theory of equality, and that no man must aspire to be anything more than a citizen, and that no man should endure to be anything less. While the forefathers espoused the ideas of citizenship, they compromised their position as to the equality of man in the original 13 articles of the Constitution, necessary to keep the southern states from seceding, which ended up in preserving slavery for several more years. At this point, Chesterton addresses the critics' argument that the fathers of the Republic owned black men like beasts of burden because they did not know any better. Unfortunately, this is quite inconsistent with the facts of American history. The facts show that in this problem of the Old South, the 18th century was more liberal than the 19th. There was more sympathy for the Negro in the school of Jefferson than in the school of Jefferson Davis. Jefferson, in the darkest state of his simple deism, said that the sight of slavery in his country made him tremble, remembering that God is just. His fellow Southerners, after a century of the world's advance, said that slavery itself was good, when they did not go further and say the Negro in themselves were bad. And they were supported in this by the great and growing modern suspicion that nature is unjust. Difficulties seemed inevitable to delay justice to the mind of Jefferson, and so they did to the mind of Lincoln. But that the slave was human and a servilely inhumane, that was, if anything, clearer to Jefferson than to Lincoln. The fact is that the utter separation and subordination of the black, like a beast, was a progress. It was a growth of the 19th century enlightenment and experiment, a triumph of science over superstition. The retreat from the Declaration of Independence continues with Joseph Arthur de Gobineau in his work, An Essay on the Inequality of Human Races. The joy of reading Chesterton always is to go with the footnotes and check out his references. He'll drop these names, but he won't tell you much about them. So when you want a really good read one of Chesterton's book and do the dictionary and the encyclopedia and the work that goes with the footnotes, and you can read the book for the whole year or more. It'll be a college course by the time you finish. But in this article, An Essay on the Inequality of the Human Races, begins most of the modern talk about the superiority and inferiority of racial stock, which was seized upon eagerly by the less than generous slave owners as scientific evidence of the inhumanity of Negroes. Gobineau believed that the white race was superior to the others. He thought it was best exemplified by the ancient Indo-European culture known as Aryan, with Germany having just enough of the Aryan strain to revive the white race. Gobineau claimed that ethnicity was the most important issue in history, and that ethnic differences exist permanently from the beginning of human history. Gobineau considered the Bible to be a reliable source of history and the inequality of the human races. He wrote, "Adam is the originator of our white species, and all other races were not part of the human species." Darwin's theory of evolution was further proof of the breakup of the brotherhood of man for the scientifically minded. All this materialistic hardening which replaced the remorse of Jefferson, was part of the growing evolutionary suspicion that savages were not part of the human race, or rather, that there was no such thing as the human race. The South had begun by agreeing reluctantly to the enslavement of men. The South ended by agreeing reluctantly to the emancipation of monkeys. Chesterton elucidates the complexity of democracy, of the democratic experiment in America, with regard to making citizens by using the analogy of a melting pot. The experiment of democracy, of diverse races, has been compared to a melting pot. But even that metaphor implies that the pot itself is of a certain shape and of a certain substance. The melting pot must not melt. The original shape was traced in the lines of Jeffersonian democracy, and it will remain in that shape until it becomes shapeless. America invites all men to become citizens, but it implies that the dogma that there is such a thing as citizenship, only so far as its primary idea is concerned. It is exclusively religious because it is not racial. The American Creed is similar to the Apostles' Creed as a universal confession, professing the dogma of the nature of all men to be created equal. However, they differ because the American Creed assumes among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, while the Apostles' Creed does not assume but professes. I believe in God, the Father the Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. These two creeds differ in that Americans' prayer is for a formation of a nation of citizens in a melting pot, while the Apostles' Creed is the prayer of the mystical body of Jesus Christ, as handed down by the apostles, professed by the head and his members, of Christ's own church in response to the Father and the Holy Spirit for the formation of the body of Christ. The founding fathers, who bowed to nature's God, did not establish a religion. This nation is not a church, but they did establish religious freedom derived from a non-sectarian source of nature's God. At this point, Jefferson splits from the great chain of being, the hierarchical order of creation with God the Father in heaven, the Pope on earth in direct line of authority, and affirms the great tree, the state of nature, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, which empowers man, builds out of nature from the bottom up. The power is in the people, the citizens, who are the building blocks of the body of the nation coming out of the state of nature. The experiment of democracy is approaching 250 years. And now we see what has happened to a people who prayed to nature's God. The Protestants went from high church Episcopalians to low church Pentecostals, from breaking one church to separating to 24,000 and still counting religions, which will soon collapse into Thomas's Paine religion of one man alone in nature, where he proudly proclaims, "My own mind is my own church." For all practical purposes, the melting pot has melted. If Chesterton were traveling to America today, he would not find many citizens who profess the ideals upon which America is founded. In short, he would not find many Americans in America. What he would find is most people living in America think the pursuit of happiness is to have a home or two with multiple garages full of big stuff, a big screen TV before to idle 6 hours a day, a Sabbath for excursions to malls or superstores, an annual outing to Disney World or other such meccas of delight. He would find people professing dual allegiances by calling themselves African Americans, Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, gay Americans, Colombian Americans, all who had formed political offices, to grieve their rights to the American dream of a house, a job, a car, a sexual union with whomever, whatever. Chesterton saw what was happening to the idea of America in 1921 in a concluding chapter entitled The Future of Democracy. It would be the worst sort of insincerity, therefore, to conclude even so hazy an outline of so great and majestic a matter as the American democratic experiment, without testifying my belief that to this also the ultimate test will come. So far as democracy becomes or remains Catholic and Christian, that democracy will remain democratic. Insofar as she does not, it will become wildly and wickedly undemocratic. Its rich will riot with a brutal indifference far beyond the feeble feudalism which retains some shadow of responsibility, or at least patronage. Its wage slaves will either sink into heathen slavery or seek relief from theories that are destructive not merely in method, but in aim, since they are but the negations of the human appetites of property and personality. The negation of property since Jeffersonian democracy is obvious in the heartland of Nebraska, where I live, where agribusinessmen have replaced the family farm and farm up to 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 acres. One person can farm that much now. The denial of personality, of the unalienable right to life, upon which America is founded, is evident in the holocaust of the millions of babies taken from their mothers' wombs before they could legally set foot in America. Abortion, remember, was legally sanctioned by the Supreme Court of the United States of America. What is to be done? Like all other dual alliance groups, Catholic Americans are Catholic first and Americans second. We profess two creeds, the Apostles' Creed and the Americans' Creed. The world cannot keep its own ideals. The secular order cannot make secure any one of its own noble and natural conceptions of secular perfection. That will be found, as time goes on, the ultimate argument for a church independent of the world and of the secular order, that has become what has become of all those ideal figures, from the wise man of the Stoics to the democratic deist of the 18th century. What has become of all the purely human hierarchy of chivalry with its punctilious pattern of the good knight, its ardent ambition in the young squire? The very name of knight has become to represent the petty triumph of the profiteer, and the very word of squire, the petty tyranny of a landlord. What has become of all the golden liberality of the humanist, who found on the high tablelands of the culture of Hellas the very balance of repose and beauty that is most lacking in the modern world? The very Greek language that they loved has become a mere label for stuffy and snobbish dons, and a mere cockshy for cheap and half-educated utilitarians, who make it a symbol of superstition and reaction. We have lived to see a time when the heroic legends of the Republic and the Citizen, which seemed to Jefferson the eternal youth of the world, has begun to grow old, and in turn, we cannot recover the earthly estate of knighthood, to which all the colors and complications of heraldry seemed as fresh and as natural as flowers. We cannot reenact the intellectual experience of the humanist, for whom Greek grammar was like a song of a bird in a spring. The more the matter is considered, the clearer it will seem that these old experiences are now only alive when they are found a lodgment in the Catholic tradition of Christendom and make themselves friends forever. St. Francis is the only surviving troubadour. St. Thomas More is the only surviving humanist. St. Louis is the only surviving knight. Father James Shaw, one of my favorite Chestertonians over the years. As these young men, I'm with young men, they're very young, but notes that in his book, The Mind That Is Catholic, by Father Shaw, which is a great book of essays of his. The Catholic mind understands with Aristotle that a small error in the beginning leads to a larger error in the end. The small error that Thomas Jefferson commits in the Declaration of Independence is that of being a deist, of professing nature's God, who set the universe in motion, but never interferes to set it right. So much for reforming the culture by taking her back to her original form. We're going to have to go further. De Tocqueville rightly sees, from his book on what he saw in America, among the various Christian doctrines, Catholicism seems one of the most favorable to the equality of conditions. For Catholics, religious society is composed of two elements, priest and people. The priest is raised above the faithful, all below him are equal. In matters of dogma, the Catholic Church places all intellects on the same level. The learned man and the ignorant, the genius and the common herd, must all subscribe to the same detail of beliefs. Rich and poor must follow the same observances. And this imposes the same austerities upon the strong and the weak. It makes no compromise with any mortal, but applying the same standard to every human being, it mingles all the classes of society at the foot of the same altar, just as they are mingled in the light of God. There is a world of difference between being melted together as citizens in a pot and mingling before the foot of the same altar in the sight of God. So how are we going to transform the culture with the arts? This is the hard part. We have to hold the first God-given rights of Americans up to Americans, the right to life. This needs to be done by evangelizing the Catholic faith, the guardian of the human person as a member of the body of the Christ, by infiltrating the culture of death through the arts. As a teacher, I do this through philosophy and literature, working with one student at a time. This semester, I'm teaching 2 sections of Philosophy 188, The Meaning of Life, to 50 first semester freshmen, all of whom are 18. I started with E.F. Schumacher's A Guide for the Perplexed, in which he presents the great chain of being, the order of the cosmos from the top down, God, angels, man, animal, plant, mineral. This is contrasted with the evolutionary theory of man's entrance into the world from the Big Bang, expanding accidentally outward from the lowest states of being to the higher states of being, from mineral to plant to animal, concluding with man as an animal without a free will. In the latter, Schumacher explains that life, consciousness, and self-awareness are the mysteries which distinguish the levels of being, and are not objects of scientific investigation as they are invisible. That's an important point, that life, consciousness, and self-awareness are invisible, and science can't study them. Biology does not study life. You can't find life. They're invisible, they're unquantifiable, and therefore not measurable. The mystery of creation are accessible through the imagination, which is the medium for pulling the soul beyond the levels of sensory investigation of the sciences. Man's vision is not limited to his eyes informing the brain, but through the imagination and seeing images and ideas with the eyes of the heart. Man's soul is formed in his movement back to God. The heart has reasons which reason does not know, says Pascal. Next, our students and I move to the Declaration of Independence, of which very few of them have ever seen or read. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now for the questions. Who gives an American his rights? What are his rights? Who gave you life? Is the life you house in your body your own? What is liberty? Is it the freedom to do anything you want? Can you do anything you want? Given that God is the author of your rights, what are you to pursue in order to be happy? Next, we read a picture of Dorian Gray from Ignatius Press, developed by Joseph Pierce. The soul in Schumacher's great chain of being is moved by images and ideas. Art is the signature of man. In this work, we examine ideas such as those of Lord Henry, who in his low musical voice says to Dorian Gray, I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression, and every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies of medievalism and return to the Hellenic idea, to find something finer, richer than the Hellenic idea, it may be. Every impulse that we strive to strangle broods in the mind and poisons us. The body sins once and has done with sin, for action is a mode of purification. Nothing remains but the recollection of a pleasure or the luxury of a regret. The only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it. With a bunch of 18-year-olds in the room, this is a scary point in the class. But I try to maintain. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it was forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made more monstrous and unlawful. It has been said that the great events of the world take place in the brain. It is in the brain, and the brain only, that the great sins of the world should take place. Would you have a full life if you were to give every form to every feeling, expression, and every thought and reality to every dream? What does Lord Henry mean when he says that the great events in your world take place in your brain? Is this the same as the great events in your world taking place in your soul? Please explain. I trust Dale Alquist, Kevin O'Brien, and Joseph Pierce will address how the arts are going to save the culture. Now that I have shown what G.K. Chesterton saw in America and how we are in the time of the ultimate test before the culture of death. Thank you.